Chapters 39 through 41 of History of Rome from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 39: The Flavian Emperors. Vespasian, 69 through 79. The East now made a claim for the emperor, and on July 1, 69, the soldiers who were engaged in war against the revolted Jews in Judea proclaimed as emperor their commander, Titus Flavius Vespasianus. He left the conduct of the war in charge of his son Titus, and arrived at Rome in 70. Here he overthrew and put to death Vitellius. In the course of this struggle the Capitol was burned. This he restored, rebuilding also a large part of the city. In his own life Vespasian was simple, putting to shame the luxury and extravagance of the nobles, and causing a marked improvement in the general tone of society. He removed from the Senate many improper members, replacing them by able men, among whom was Agricola. In 70 he put down a formidable rebellion in Gaul, and when his son Titus returned from the capture of Jerusalem, (Footnote: Jerusalem was taken in 70 after a siege of several months, the horrors of which have been graphically detailed by the Jewish historian Josephus, who was present in the army of Titus. The city was destroyed, and the inhabitants sold into slavery. They enjoyed a joint triumph. The temple of Janus was closed, and peace prevailed during the remainder of his reign. Much money was spent on public works, and in beautifying the city. A new forum was built, a temple of peace, public baths, and the famous Colosseum was begun, receiving its name from the Colossus, a statue of Nero which had stood near by. On the whole, Vespasian was active and prudent in public affairs, frugal and virtuous in private life. The decade of his reign was marked by peace and general prosperity. One of the ablest men of this age was Agricola, 37 through 93. Born at Forum Julii in Gaul, he was made governor of Aquitania by Vespasian in 73. 4 years later he was consul, and the next year was sent to Britain, which he conquered, and governed with marked ability and moderation, increasing the prosperity of the people and advancing their civilization. He remained in Britain until 85, when he was recalled. His life was written by his son-in-law, the historian Tacitus. Titus, 79 through 81. Vespasian was succeeded by his son Titus, who emulated the virtues of his father. He finished the Colosseum, begun by Vespasian, and built a triumphal arch to commemorate his victories over the Jews. This arch, called the Arch of Titus, was built on the highest part of the Via Sacra, and on its walls was carved a representation of the sacred candlestick of the Jewish temple, which can still be seen. It was during this reign that Herculaneum and Pompeii were destroyed by an eruption of Vesuvius. In this eruption perished Pliny the Elder, the most noted writer of his day. His work on natural history, the only one of his writings that is preserved, shows that he was a true student. His passion for investigation led him to approach too near the volcano, and caused his death. Domitian, 81 through 96. Domitian was the opposite of his brother Titus. Cruel, passionate, and extravagant, he was murdered after a reign of 15 years, during which he earned the hatred and contempt of his subjects by his crimes and inconsistencies. In his foreign policy, Domitian showed considerable ability. He added to the empire that part of Germany which corresponds to modern Baden and Würtemberg, and built a line of fortifications from Mentz on the Rhine to Ratisbon on the Danube. With him ended the line of the Flavian emperors, and he was also the last of the so-called 12 Caesars, a name given them by the historian Suetonius. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40. The 5 Good Emperors. Nerva, 96 through 98. Nerva was appointed by the Senate to succeed Domitian, and was the first emperor who did not owe his advancement to military force or influence. He associated with himself Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, then in command of the army on the Rhine. Nerva ruled only 16 months, but during that time he restored tranquillity among the people, conferring happiness and prosperity upon every class. Trajan, 98 through 117. Nerva was succeeded by Trajan, whose character has its surest guarantee in the love and veneration of his subjects, and it is said that long afterwards the highest praise that could be bestowed on a ruler was that he was more fortunate than Augustus and better than Trajan. Trajan was a soldier, and if he lacked the refinements of a peaceful life, he was nevertheless a wise and firm master. He added to the empire Dacia, the country included between the Danube and the Theiss, the Carpathians, and the Pruth. This territory became so thoroughly Romanized that the language of its inhabitants today is founded on that of their conquerors nearly 18 centuries ago. It was in honor of this campaign into Dacia that the famous Column of Trajan, which still remains, was erected. Trajan also annexed to the empire Arabia Petrea, which afforded an important route between Egypt and Syria. His invasion of Parthia, however, resulted in no permanent advantage. During the reign of Trajan, the Roman Empire reached the summit of its power, but the first signs of decay were beginning to be seen in the financial distress of all Italy, and the decline of the free peasantry, until in the next century they were reduced to a condition of practical serfdom. The literature of Trajan's reign was second only to that of the Augustan age. His time has often been called the Silver Age. Its prose writers were, however, unlike those of the Augustan age, far superior to its poets. The most famous prose writers were Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and Quintilian. The poets of this period were Juvenal, Persius, Martial, Lucan, and Statius, of whom the last two were of an inferior order. Hadrian, 117 through 138. Trajan was succeeded by his cousin's son, Hadrian, a native of Spain. One of the first acts of Hadrian was to relinquish the recent conquests of Trajan, and to restore the old boundaries of the empire. The reasons for this were that they had reached the utmost limits which could lend strength to the power of Rome, or be held in subjection without constant and expensive military operations. The people occupying the new conquests were hardy and warlike, scattered over a country easy of defense, and certain to strive constantly against a foreign yoke. Hadrian displayed constant activity in traveling over the empire to overlook personally its administration and protection. He visited Britain, where he crushed the inroads of the Caledonians, and built a fortified line of works known as the Picts' Wall, extending from sea to sea. The remains of this great work are still to be seen, corresponding nearly to the modern boundary between England and Scotland. He also visited the East, where the Jews were making serious trouble, and completed their overthrow. On his return to the city, the Emperor devoted himself to its adornment. Several of his works, more or less complete, still remain. The most famous of these is the mausoleum tomb of Hadrian, now known as the Castle of San Angelo. Hadrian was afflicted with bad health, suffering much from diseases from which he could find no relief. On account of this, and to secure a proper succession, he associated with himself in the government Titus Aurelius Antoninus, and required him to adopt Marcus Annius Verus and Lucius Verus. In 138, soon after this arrangement was made, Hadrian died, leaving the empire to Titus. Titus Aurelius Antoninus Pius, 138 161. Antoninus, a native of Gaul, was 52 years old when he succeeded to the throne. The cognomen Pius was conferred upon him by the Senate on account of the affectionate respect which he had shown for Hadrian. He was a man of noble appearance, firm and prudent, and under him the affairs of state moved smoothly. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, 161 180. On the death of Antoninus, Marcus Annius Verus succeeded him under the title of Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. The Moors made an invasion into Spain. The barbarians broke into Gaul. The army in Britain attempted to set up another emperor, and the Parthians in the East were in an uneasy state. The Eastern War, however, ended favorably, and the Parthian king purchased peace by ceding Mesopotamia to Rome. But the returning army brought with it a pestilence, which spread devastation throughout the West. The Christians were charged with being the cause of the plague, and were cruelly persecuted. Among the victims were Justin Martyr at Rome, and Polycarp at Smyrna. The death of Lucius Verus in 168 released Aurelius from a colleague who attracted attention only by his unfitness for his position. The Emperor was thus relieved of embarrassments which might well have become his greatest danger. The remainder of his reign, however, was scarcely less unhappy. The dangers from the troublesome barbarians grew greater and greater. Rome had now passed the age of conquest, and began to show inability even to defend what she had acquired. For 14 years Aurelius was engaged on the frontiers, fighting these barbarians, and endeavoring to check their advance. He died at Vienna while thus occupied, in the 59th year of his life, 180. Peace was shortly afterwards made with the barbarians, a peace bought with money, an example often followed in later times, when Rome lacked the strength and courage to enforce her wishes by force of arms. Marcus Aurelius was the philosopher of the empire. His tastes were quiet. He was unassuming, and intent on the good of the people. His faults were amiable weaknesses; his virtues, those of a hero. His meditations have made him known as an author of fine tastes and thoughts. With him ended the line of the good emperors. After his death, Rome's prosperity and power began rapidly to wane. The Christians. The Christians, who were gradually increasing in numbers, were persecuted at different times throughout the empire. One ground for these persecutions was that it was a crime against the state to refuse to worship the gods of the Romans, under whom the empire had flourished. It was also the custom to burn incense in front of the emperor's statue as an act of adoration. The Christians not only refused homage to the Roman gods, but denounced the burning of incense as sacrilegious. Aurelius gave his sanction to the most general persecution this sect had yet suffered. The last combined effort to suppress them was under Diocletian in 284, but it ended with the Edict of Milan in 312, which famous decree gave the imperial license to the religion of Christ. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41. Period of military despotism. Decline of the empire. Commodus, 180 through 192. On the death of Aurelius, his son Commodus hastened to Rome, and was received by both the Senate and army without opposition. His character was the opposite of that of his good father. In ferocity and vindictiveness he was almost unequaled, even among the emperors of unhappy Rome. By means of informers, who were well paid, he rid himself of the best members of the Senate. His government became so corrupt, he himself so notorious in crime, that he was unendurable. His proudest boasts were of his triumphs in the amphitheatre, and of his ability to kill 100 lions with as many arrows. After a reign of 12 years, his servants rid the empire of his presence. Pertinax, 192 through 193. Pertinax, the prefect of the city, an old and experienced senator, followed Commodus. His reign of 3 months was well meant, but as it was not supported by the military, it was of no effect. His attempted reforms were stopped by his murder. Julianus, 193. Septimius Severus, 193 through 211. The Praetorians now offered the crown to the highest bidder, who proved to be Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator. He paid about $1,000 to each soldier of the guard, 12,000 in number. After enjoying the costly honor 2 months, he was deposed and executed. In the meantime, several soldiers had been declared emperor by their respective armies. Among them was Septimius Severus, an African belonging to the army of the Danube. Severus was an able soldier. He disarmed the Praetorians, banished them from Rome, and filled their place with 50,000 legionaries, who acted as his bodyguard. The person whom he placed in command of this guard was made to rank next to himself, with legislative, judicial, and financial powers. The Senate he reduced to a nonentity. After securing the capital, Severus carried on a campaign against the Parthians, and was victorious over the rulers of Mesopotamia and Arabia. In 203 he erected, in commemoration of these victories, a magnificent arch, which still stands at the head of the Forum. He died at Eboracum, York, in Britain, while making preparations for a campaign against the Caledonians. Caracalla, Macrinus, and Heliogabalus. Severus left 2 sons, both of whom he had associated with himself in the government. No sooner was he dead than they quarreled, and the elder, Caracalla, murdered the other with his own hand in the presence of their mother. Caracalla was bloodthirsty and cruel. After a short reign, 211 through 216, he was murdered by one of his soldiers. By him were begun the famous baths which bore his name, and of which extensive remains still exist. Caracalla was succeeded by Macrinus, who reigned but 1 year, and was followed by Heliogabalus, 218 through 222, a priest of the sun, a true Oriental, with but few virtues. His end was like that of his predecessors. The Praetorians revolted and murdered him. From Alexander Severus to the age of the 30 tyrants, 222 through 268. Alexander Severus was a good man and well educated, but he endeavored in vain to check the decline of the state. The military had become all-powerful, and he could effect nothing against it. During his reign, 222 through 235, the famous baths begun by Caracalla were finished. Severus was killed in a mutiny led by Maximin, who was emperor for 3 years, 235 through 238, and was then murdered by his mutinous soldiers. Gordian, his successor, 238 through 244, was also slain by his own soldiers in his camp on the Euphrates, and Philip, 244 through 249, and Decius, 249 through 251, both fell in battle. Under Decius was begun a persecution of the Christians severer than any that preceded it. The next 17 years, 251 through 268, is a period of great confusion. Several generals in different provinces were declared emperor. The empire nearly fell to pieces, but finally rallied without loss of territory. Its weakness, however, was apparent to all. This period is often called the Age of the 30 Tyrants. 5 good emperors, 268 through 283. 5 good emperors now ruled and revived somewhat the shattered strength of the government. Claudius, 268 through 270, Aurelian, 270 through 275, Tacitus, 275 through 276, Probus, 276 through 282, and Carus, 282 through 283. Aurelian undertook a campaign against the famous Zenobia, queen of Palmyra. In her he found a worthy foe, one whose political ability was rendered more brilliant by her justice and courage. Defeated in the field, she fortified herself in Palmyra, which was taken after a siege and destroyed. Zenobia was carried to Rome, where she graced the triumph of her conqueror, but was afterwards permitted to live in retirement. Aurelian was the first who built the walls of Rome in their present position. Diocletian, 284 through 305. With this ruler, the last vestige of the old republican form of government at Rome disappears. Old Rome was dead. Her Senate had lost the last remnant of its respectability. Seeing the necessity of a more united country and a firmer rule, Diocletian associated with himself Maximian, a gigantic soldier, who signalized his accession by subduing a dangerous revolt in Gaul. He also appointed 2 officers, Galerius and Constantius, whom he called Caesars, one to have charge of the East and the other of the West. By means of these assistants he crushed all revolts, strengthened the waning power of the empire, and imposed peace and good order upon the world. Diocletian and Maximian afterwards resigned, and allowed their two Caesars to assume the rank of Augusti, and they in their turn appointed Caesars as assistants. Soon after his accession, Constantius died, and his son Constantine was proclaimed Caesar, against the wishes of Galerius. A bitter struggle followed, in which Constantine finally overcame all his opponents, and was declared sole emperor. For his successes he was named the Great. Constantine the Great, 306 through 337. Constantine determined to build for his empire a new capital, which should be worthy of him. He selected the site of Byzantium as offering the greatest advantages, for, being defended on three sides by the sea and the Golden Horn, it could easily be made almost impregnable, while as a seaport its advantages were unrivaled, a feature not in the least shared by Rome. The project was entered upon with energy. The city was built and named Constantinople. To people it, the seat of government, was permanently removed thither, and every inducement was offered to immigration. Thus was born the Greek Empire, destined to drag out a miserable existence for nearly 1,000 years after Rome had fallen a prey to the barbarians. Its founder died after a reign of 30 years in his 64th year, 337. Constantine is entitled to great credit for the uniform kindness with which he treated his Christian subjects. It is said that his mother, Helena, was a Christian, and that it was to her influence that this mildness was due. The sect, notwithstanding many persecutions, had kept on increasing, until now we find them a numerous and quite influential body. It was during his reign that the Decree of Milan was issued, in 313, giving the imperial license to the religion of Christ, and also in this reign the famous Council of Nice in Bithynia, 325, met to settle questions of creed. In person, Constantine was tall and majestic. He was dexterous in all warlike accomplishments, intrepid in war, affable in peace, patient and prudent in council, bold and unhesitating in action. Ambition alone led him to attack the East, and the very madness of jealousy marked his course after his success. He was filial in his affection towards his mother, but he can scarcely be called affectionate who put to death his father-in-law, his brother-in-law, his wife, and his son. If he was great in his virtues, in his faults he was contemptible. Decline of the Empire. Constantine was succeeded by his three sons, Constantine II., Constantius, and Constans, who divided the empire among themselves, 337 through 353. Constantine and Constans almost at once quarreled over the possession of Italy, and the difficulty was ended only by the death of the former. The other two brothers lived in harmony for some time, because the Persian War in the East occupied Constantius, while Constans was satisfied with a life of indolence and dissipation. Constans was murdered in 350, and his brother was sole emperor. He died 10 years later, and was succeeded by his cousin Julian, 360 through 363. Julian was a good soldier, and a man calculated to win the love and respect of all, but he attempted to restore the old religion, and thus gained for himself the epithet of apostate. The Christians, however, had too firm a hold on the state to admit of their powers being shaken. The failure of Julian precluded any similar attempt afterward. After a reign of 3 years, he was killed in an expedition against the Persians. His successor, Jovian (363 364), who was chosen by the army, died after a reign of only 7 months. Valentinian and Valens (364 375). After a brief interregnum, the throne was bestowed on Valentinian, who associated with himself his brother Valens. The empire was divided. Valens took the East, with Constantinople as his capital. Valentinian took the West, making Milan the seat of his government. So completely had Rome fallen from her ancient position that it is very doubtful if this monarch ever visited the city during his reign. Footnote: Since the building of Constantinople, no emperor had lived in Rome. She had ceased to be mistress even of the West, and rapidly fell to the rank of a provincial city. He died during a campaign on the Danube. His son, Gratian (375 383) succeeded him. He discouraged paganism, and under him Christianity made rapid strides. His uncle Valens was slain in a battle against the Goths. But so completely were the Eastern and Western empires now separated, that Gratian did not attempt to make himself sole ruler, but appointed Theodosius to the empty throne. Gratian, like so many of his predecessors, was murdered. His successors, Maximus (383 388), Valentinian II. (388 392), and Eugenius (392 394), were either deposed or assassinated, and again there was, for a short time, one ruler of the whole empire, Theodosius, whom Gratian had made Emperor of the East. He was sole emperor for 1 year (394 395). On his death, his 2 sons divided the empire, Honorius (395 423) taking the West, and Arcadius the East. Honorius was only 6 years old when he began to reign. He was placed under the care of a Vandal named Stilicho, to whom he was allied by marriage. Stilicho was a man of ability. The barbarians were driven from the frontiers on the Rhine and in Britain. A revolt in Africa was suppressed. Honorius himself was weak and jealous. He did not hesitate to murder Stilicho as soon as he was old enough to see the power he was wielding. With Stilicho's death, his fortune departed. Rome was besieged, captured, and sacked by the barbarian Alaric in 410. When this evil was past, numerous contestants arose in different parts of the empire, each eager for a portion of the fabric which was now so obviously crumbling to pieces. Honorius was succeeded, after one of the longest reigns of the imperial line, by Valentinian III. (423 455). The empire was but a relic of its former self. Gaul, Spain, and Britain were practically lost. Illyria and Pannonia were in the hands of the Goths, and Africa was soon after seized by the barbarians. Valentinian was fortunate in the possession of Titus, a Scythian by birth, who for a time upheld the Roman name, winning for himself the title of "Last of the Romans." He was assassinated by his ungrateful master. A few months later, in 455, the Emperor himself was killed by a senator, Maximus, who succeeded him but for only 3 months, when Avitus (455 456), a noble of Gaul, became emperor. He was deposed by Ricimer (457 467), a Sueve of considerable ability, who for some time managed the affairs of the empire, making and unmaking its monarchs at pleasure. After the removal of Avitus, 10 months were allowed to elapse before a successor was appointed, and then the crown was bestowed upon Majorian (457 461). Severus followed him, a man too weak to interfere with the plans of Ricimer. After his death, Ricimer ruled under the title of Patrician, until the people demanded an emperor, and he appointed Anthemius (467 472), who attempted to strengthen his position by marrying a daughter of Ricimer, but jealousy soon sprang up between them. Ricimer invited a horde of barbarians from across the Alps, with whom he captured and sacked Rome, and killed Anthemius. Shortly after, Ricimer himself died. Names which appear only as names now follow each other in rapid succession. Finally, in 476, Zeno, Emperor of the East, declared the office of Emperor of the West abolished, and gave the government of the diocese of Italy to Odoacer, with the title of Patrician. End of chapter 41. End of section 16. Chapters 42 and 43 of History of Rome, from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 42: Invasions and Distribution of the Barbarians. The sieges and captures of Rome by the barbarians we present in a separate chapter, instead of in the narrative of the emperors, because by this plan a better idea of the operations can be given, and especially because we can thus obtain a clearer and more comprehensive conception of the rise of the nations, which, tearing in pieces the Roman Empire, have made up modern Europe. The Huns, who originated the movement which overthrew the Western Empire, came, it is supposed, from the eastern part of Asia. As they moved westward, their march was irresistible. In 395 they met and defeated the Goths, a powerful tribe that lived to the north of the Danube, and who were ruled by a king named Hermanric. The Gothic nation consisted of two branches, the Ostrogoths, Eastern Goths, and the Visigoths, Western Goths. Of these, the Ostrogoths were the more powerful, but on the approach of the Huns they were obliged to submit. The Huns moved on, and found but little trouble in overrunning the country of the Visigoths, who were so terrified by the hideous appearance and wild shouts of the Huns that they fled to the Danube, and besought the Romans to allow them to cross the river and take refuge in their territory. The favor was granted, but the refugees were treated with indignity and compelled to undergo every privation. Subsequently, a remnant of the Ostrogoths arrived at the Danube, also desiring to cross. To them permission was refused, but they seized shipping and crossed, despite the prohibition of the Romans. They found the condition of their brethren, the Visigoths, so sad that they united with them in open revolt, defeated a Roman army sent against them, and ravaged Thrace. The Emperor Valens took the field in person, and was defeated (378). The Goths then moved southward and westward into Greece, everywhere pillaging the country. When Theodosius became emperor, he acted cautiously, fortifying strong points from which to watch the enemy and select a favorable moment for an attack. At length he surprised their camp and gained a complete victory. The Goths were taken into the service of the Empire, and the first chapter of the barbarian invasion of the Empire was brought to a close. We now meet two of the great names connected with the fall of Rome, Alaric and Stilicho. Theodosius was succeeded by Arcadius, and before the end of the year the Goths broke into open revolt under their leader Alaric. Athens was compelled to pay a ransom. Corinth, Argos, and Sparta were taken and plundered. No place was strong enough to offer effectual resistance. At this juncture, Stilicho, general of the Western Empire, hastened to the scene, and succeeded in surrounding the Goths, but Alaric burst through his lines and escaped. He then made peace with Constantinople, and the office of Master General of Illyricum was bestowed upon him. How sincere the barbarian was in his offers of peace may be seen from the fact that in 2 years he invaded Italy (400). Honorius, who was then Emperor of the West, was a man so weak that even the genius of Stilicho could not save him. No sooner did he hear of the approach of Alaric than he hastened to a place of safety for himself, leaving Stilicho to defend Rome. Troops were called from Britain, Gaul, and the other provinces far and near, leaving their places vacant and defenseless. Honorius, who had attempted to escape to Gaul, was surprised by Alaric, and taking refuge in the fortified town of Asta, was there besieged until the arrival of the brave Stilicho, who attacked the besiegers, and after a bloody fight utterly routed them. In his retreat, Alaric attempted to attack Verona, but he was again defeated, and escaped only by the fleetness of his horse. Honorius returned home (404), and enjoyed a triumph. Rome had scarcely time to congratulate herself upon her escape from the Goths when she was threatened by a new enemy. The Huns, pushing westward, had dislodged the northern tribes of Germany who dwelt on the Baltic. These were the Alans, Sueves, Vandals, and Burgundians. Under the leadership of Radagaisus, these tribes invaded Italy with about 200,000 men. They were met near Florence by Stilicho, and totally defeated (406). Radagaisus himself was killed. The survivors turned backward, burst into Gaul, ravaged the lower portion of the country, and finally separated. One portion, the Burgundians, remained on the frontier, and from their descendants comes the name of Burgundy. The Alans, Sueves, and Vandals pushed on into Spain, where they established kingdoms. The Alans occupied the country at the foot of the Pyrenees, but were soon after subdued by the Visigoths. The Sueves settled in the northwest of Spain, but met the same fate as the Alans. The Vandals occupied the southern part, and from there crossed over to Africa, where they maintained themselves for nearly a century, and at one time were powerful enough, as we shall see, to capture Rome itself. Rome was now for a time delivered from her enemies, and the Emperor, no longer needing Stilicho, was easily persuaded that he was plotting for the throne. He was put to death with many of his friends. With Stilicho, Rome fell. Scarcely 2 months after his death, Alaric again appeared before Rome. He sought to starve the city into submission. Famine and pestilence raged within its walls. Finally, peace was purchased by a large ransom, and Alaric withdrew, but soon returned. the city was betrayed, and after a lapse of 8 centuries became the second time a prey to the barbarians (August 24, 410). The city was plundered for 5 days, and then Alaric withdrew to ravage the surrounding country. But the days of this great leader were almost spent. Before the end of the year he died, and shortly after his army marched into France, where they established a kingdom reaching from the Loire and the Rhone to the Straits of Gibraltar. The Germans, under their king Clodion, prompted by the example of the Burgundians and Visigoths, began, about 425, a series of attempts to enlarge their boundaries. They succeeded in establishing themselves firmly in all the country from the Rhine to the Somme, and under the name of Franks founded the present French nation in France (447). Clodion left 2 sons, who quarreled over the succession. The elder appealed to the Huns for support, the younger to Rome. The Huns at this time were ruled by Attila, the scourge of God. The portrait of this monster is thus painted. His features bore the mark of his Eastern origin. He had a large head, a swarthy complexion, small, deep-seated eyes, a flat nose, a few hairs in the place of a beard, broad shoulders, and a short, square body of nervous strength, though disproportioned form. This man wielded at will, it is said, an army of over 500,000 troops. At the time he received from the son of Clodion the invitation to interfere in the affairs of Gaul, Attila was already contemplating an invasion of both the Western and Eastern empires. But the prospect of an ally in Gaul, with an opportunity of afterwards attacking Italy from the west, was too favorable to be neglected. A march of 600 miles brought the Huns to the Rhine. Crossing this, they continued their progress, sacking and burning whatever cities lay in their route. The Visigoths, under Theodoric, joining the Romans under Aetius, met the Huns near Orleans. Attila retreated towards Chalons, where in 451 was fought a great battle, which saved the civilization of Western Europe. Attila began the attack. He was bravely met by the Romans, and a charge of the Visigoths completed the discomfiture of the savages. Aetius did not push his victory, but allowed the Huns to retreat in the direction of Italy. The scourge first attacked, captured, and razed to the ground Aquileia. He then scoured the whole country, sparing only those who preserved their lives by the surrender of their wealth. It was to this invasion that Venice owed its rise. The inhabitants, who fled from the approach of the Huns, found on the islands in the lagoons at the head of the Adriatic a harbor of safety. Attila died shortly after, 453, from the bursting of a blood vessel, and with his death the empire of the Huns ceased to exist. The Vandals, we have seen, had established themselves in Africa. They were now ruled by Genseric. Carthage was their headquarters, and they were continually ravaging the coasts of the Mediterranean with their fleets. Maximus, Emperor of Rome, 455, had forcibly married Eudoxia, the widow of the previous Emperor Valentinian, whom he had killed. She, in revenge, sent to Genseric a secret message to attack Rome. He at once set sail for the mouth of the Tiber. The capital was delivered into his hands on his promise to spare the property of the Church (June, 455), and for 14 days the Vandals ravaged it at pleasure. Genseric then left Rome, taking with him Eudoxia. This was the last sack of the city by barbarians, but 21 years elapsed before the Roman Empire came to an end (476). End of chapter 42. Chapter 43. Roman literature. Plautus, 254 to 184. Plautus, the comic poet, was one of the earliest of Roman writers. Born at Sarsina in Umbria, of free parentage, he at first worked on the stage at Rome, but lost his savings in speculation. Then for some time he worked in a treadmill, but finally gained a living by translating Greek comedies into Latin. 20 of his plays have come down to us. They are lively, graphic, and full of fun, depicting a mixture of Greek and Roman life. Terence, 195 to 159. Terence was a native of Carthage. He was brought to Rome at an early age, as a slave of the Senator Terentius, by whom he was educated and liberated. 6 of his comedies are preserved. Like the plays of Plautus, they are free translations from the Greek, and of the same general character. Ennius, 139 69. Quintus Ennius, a native of Rudiae, was taken to Rome by Cato the Younger. Here he supported himself by teaching Greek. His epic poem, the Annales, relates the traditional Roman history from the arrival of Ennius to the poet's own day. Cicero, 106 43. Marcus Tullius Cicero, a native of Arpínum, ranks as the first prose writer in Roman literature. As an orator, Cicero had a very happy natural talent. The extreme versatility of his mind, his lively imagination, his great sensitiveness, his inexhaustible richness of expression, which was never at a loss for a word or tone to suit any circumstances or mood, his felicitous memory, his splendid voice and impressive figure, all contributed to render him a powerful speaker. He himself left nothing undone to attain perfection. Not until he had spent a long time in laborious study and preparation did he make his debut as an orator, nor did he ever rest and think himself perfect, but always working, made the most careful preparation for every case. Each success was to him only a step to another still higher achievement, and by continual meditation and study he kept himself fully equipped for his task. Hence he succeeded, as is universally admitted, in gaining a place beside Demosthenes, or at all events second only to him. There are extant 57 orations of Cicero, and fragments of 20 more. His famous Philippics against Antony caused his proscription by the Second Triumvirate, and his murder near his villa at Formiae, in December 43. His chief writings on rhetoric were De Orator, Brutus de Claris Oratoribus, and Orator ad M. Brutum. Cicero was a lover of philosophy, and his writings on the subject were numerous. Those most read are De Senectute, De Amicitia, and De Officiis. 864 of Cicero's letters are extant, and they furnish an inexhaustible treasure of contemporaneous history. Caesar, 100 44. Of Caesar's literary works, the most important are his Commentarii, containing the history of the first 7 years of the Gallic War, and the history of the civil strife down to the Alexandrine War. The account of his last year in Gaul was written probably by Aulus Hirtius; that of the Alexandrine, African, and Spanish wars by some unknown hand. As an orator, Caesar ranks next to Cicero. Nepos, 94 24. Cornelius Nepos, a native of northern Italy, was a friend of both Cicero and Atticus. He was a prolific writer, but only his De Viris Illustribus is preserved. It shows neither historical accuracy nor good style. Lucretius, 98 55. Titus Lucretius Carus has left a didactic poem, De Rerum Natura. The tone of the work is sad, and in many places bitter. Catullus, 87 47. Gaius Valerius Catullus of Verona is the greatest lyric poet of Roman literature. 116 of his poems are extant. Virgil, 70 19. The great epic Roman poet was Virgil. His Aeneas, in 12 books, gives an account of the wanderings and adventures of Aeneas, and his struggles to found a city in Italy. The poem was not revised when Virgil died, and it was published contrary to his wishes. Besides the Aeneas, Virgil wrote the Bucolica, 10 eclogues, imitated and partially translated from the Greek poet Theocritus. The Georgica, a poem of 4 books on agriculture and its different branches, is considered his most finished work, and the most perfect production of Roman art poetry. Horace, 65 8. Quintus Horatius Flaccus left 4 books of odes, 1 of epodes, 2 of satires, 2 of epistles, and the Ars Poetica. Tibullus, 54 29. Albius Tibullus, an elegiac poet, celebrated in exquisitely fine poems the beauty and cruelty of his mistresses. Propertius, 49 15. Sextus Propertius, a native of Umbria, was also an elegiac poet, and wrote mostly on love. Ovid, 43 B.C. through 18 A.D. Publius Ovidius Naso left 3 books of Amores, 1 of Heroides, the Ars Amatoria, Remedia Amoris, the Metamorphoses, 15 books, the Tristia, and the Fasti. Livy, 59 B.C. through 17 A.D. Titus Livius left a history of Rome, of which 35 books have been preserved. Phaedrus. Phaedrus, a writer of fables, flourished in the reign of Tiberius, 14 37. He was originally a slave. His fables are 97 in number, and are written in iambic verse. Seneca, 8 B.C. through 65 A.D. For an account of this writer, see the chapter on the Emperor Nero. Curtius. Quintus Curtius Rufus was a historian who lived in the reign of Claudius, 50 A.D. He wrote a history of the exploits of Alexander the Great. Persius, 34 62. Persius, a poet of the reign of Nero, was a native of Volaterrae. He wrote 6 satires, which are obscure and hard to understand. Lucan, 39 65. Lucan, a nephew of Seneca, wrote an epic poem, not finished, called Pharsalia, upon the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. Pliny the Elder, 23 79. Gaius Plinius Secundus, of northern Italy, was a great scholar in history, grammar, rhetoric, and natural science. His work on natural history has come down to us. Statius, Martial, Quintilian, Juvenal. Statius, 45 96, a native of Naples, had considerable poetical talent. He wrote the Thebaid, the Achilles (unfinished), and the Silvae. Martial, 42 102, wrote sharp and witty epigrams, of which 15 books are extant. He was a native of Spain. Quintilian, 35 95, was also a native of Spain. He was a teacher of eloquence for many years in Rome. His work on the training of an orator is preserved. Juvenal, 47 130, of Aquínum, was a great satirist, who described and attacked bitterly the vices of Roman society. 16 of his satires are still in existence. Tacitus, 54 119. Cornelius Tacitus was the great historian of his age. His birthplace is unknown. His writings are interesting and of a high tone, but often tinged with prejudice and hence unfair. He wrote 1. A dialogue on orators. 2. A biography of his father-in-law Agricola. 3. A description of the habits of the people of Germany. 4. A history of the reigns of Galba, Otho, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. Historiae. 5. Annales, a narrative of the events of the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Pliny the Younger, 62 113. Pliny the Younger was the adopted son of Pliny the Elder. He was a voluminous correspondent. We have 9 books of his letters, relating to a large number of subjects, and presenting vivid pictures of the times in which he lived. Their diction is fluent and smooth. End of chapter 43. End of section 17.